and some colleagues that I'm excited to share our time with today. A quick note, as you just heard, this is being recorded. We'll be happy to share the recording with you and those on your team as well. As a boutique women-owned recruiting firm, we are fortunate enough to partner with some of the nation's leading public and private institutions, impactful nonprofit organizations focused on the environment, mental health, and food access, as well as cutting-edge companies that are helping to shape the future of business. We at Another Source pride ourselves in striving to understand the recruitment goals of all of our clients, regardless of industry, and to provide you with incredible talent. Each of you here today have been tapped with an awesome responsibility of creating spaces for others to thrive. We'd like to think that would come easy, but as we know, it doesn't come easy. It's hard work, and it requires conscious communication, thoughtful decision-making, and oftentimes a significant amount of time influencing without authority. Through the day-to-day, we often find ourselves in a reactive state or in a deja vu moment, or bracing ourselves to respond to yet another headline that creates confusion for our teams. All of which can be mentally, emotionally, and physically exhausting. I promise you today will not be that. The next 45 minutes is about you, filling up you as you begin to prepare for 2023, providing information, insight, perspective, and wisdom that will equip you to continue building environments where your team and your colleagues thrive. Today, you'll hear from two of our partners, LaborIQ and the Courage Collective. We quite literally would not be equipped to do the work we do without them. As most of you know, we utilize LaborIQ's labor market report as we begin each search, providing critical information on compensation, competition, diversity, and geographical data. In addition to the market reports, we rely heavily on Jay's perspective as we battle the media headlines. And so we are fortunate today to have Jay Denton, the Chief Analytics Officer at LaborIQ, joining us. He's charged with leading the product and market analysis business units, and his expertise is in analyzing and distilling complex data into actionable answers for strategic business and talent decisions, things all of us here know quite well. Jay's thought leadership has been featured in Bloomberg Business, Inc., The Wall Street Journal, The New York Post, Business Insider, and many others. LaborIQ by ThinkWhy is a compensation and labor market analytics software, helping organizations drive people and business growth strategies by providing answers to today's compensation, employee retention, and job market forecasts. Thank you, Jay, for sharing your expertise with our colleagues and friends.
Thank you. I guess I'll go ahead and get started then with the presentation. Thank you, Marcy, for that introduction. Let me share my screen. I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so for my part of the presentation, and then I'll hang around afterwards in case any of you all have questions. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk a bit about what we've seen so far in 2022. It's been quite a year. I would say even a better year than we forecasted. And there could be some changes on the horizons, but we'll talk a little bit about what those scenarios look like. So I'm going to be coming at this from the angle of the way that we look at it. So as Marcy mentioned, Another Source is leveraging with these searches what we're recommending for new salaries, what the median salaries would be in terms of existing people you have on within your companies right now. And if we think about some of those, the availability of talent and so on, here's some of the themes that we do think will happen when we get to 2023. The competition for talent will ease a little bit. Like I should probably put in parentheses on the bottom left below that, because it's not like there's gonna be a flood of extra talent out there, because so far we're likely seeing mainly certain types of industries being impacted in the near term. Unemployment rates, though, will start to tick up a little bit, so that will put some more talent into the market. And we also think, there's a recent LinkedIn post I made where I mentioned that we do think that top end of the market, where we've seen salaries just almost run away for certain positions, I think the top end of the market is going to have a little bit more of a cap on it, and typical merit increases instead of big market adjustments for people already on your on your teams. more like typical merit increases will probably get back to what's normal, as we get into next year and a little bit beyond. But before we cover more on 2023, let's talk about 2022. As I mentioned, even a better market than we thought. We really thought around midsummer things would start to slow down, and they did a bit, but it's held on stronger for a longer period of time. So this year we'll end up somewhere around 76 million hires in the US. Now, the headline number, if you focus on typical stats, they get reported the first Friday of each month when the new job growth metrics come out, they typically talk about net new job gains. This is really important for business leaders, HR teams, and so on. It's not just about the net new. It's all the transition between companies. So we might, we'll add 4.5 million new jobs this year, but 76 million people were hired, which means most people getting hired switch from one job to another. That's not going to stop next year. So you've got to stay on your game in terms of being able to fill roles in 2023. Something that's going to be a challenge, though, even with, there's some inflation control measures being implemented by the Federal Reserve, different things that impacts that might have. The other one, though, that's going to remain tough, and this has been tough placing talent this year because our talent supply just isn't back to where we'd like it to be. We're missing, 2 to 4 million people that likely would have been in the job market right now if not for the pandemic. And there, in longer presentations, I go into a bunch of the details of why. We won't get into that today, but just know that two metrics that are going to continue to impact next year, whether there's more of a slowdown or not, the unemployment rate is incredibly low. At 3.7%, we were at 3.5 recently. When we were at 3.5, we're just barely above that at 3.7 ending the year. There have only been 9 months in the last, almost, 60, 70 years where it's been lower than that. And so we're at just historically low unemployment levels, which just means there's not a whole lot of talent sitting out there waiting to find a job. The other challenge that we have, we just haven't had enough people rejoin the labor force. And so who knows, inflation might push more people back into the labor force, but the fact that existing, talent that's already out there looking for a job or has a job, that number's low. And then the people re-entering the labor force is just not happening fast enough. So those are two of the things that will probably moderate our growth one way or another. But the real thing is, if you look back, and this is this might be the first time you've seen this specific chart, one thing we like to look at is think about how quickly we recovered all of the jobs from the pandemic. So what we did is we plotted the last 4 recessions, when they began, how many jobs were lost on a relative basis. Those are the lines you see on the screen, how many jobs on a relative basis, and then how long did it take to recover all of those jobs. So if you look at the orange line, that's the pandemic. We lost more jobs in the 3 recessions before it combined, and we're going to recover them faster than any of those 3 recessions. So if you just look at the slope of the line, this is unsustainable. Like, we can't stay at that pace for as quickly as we recover those jobs. So just know we're headed towards a period, no matter what, of simple math. We just can't stay at this type of trajectory. So things are going to moderate. Don't get too worked up about all of the headlines you see out there. I'll show you a few reasons why next. But first, I am going to lay out 2 different scenarios. So as we go to think about the market for 2023, we thought, okay, what's kind of a rough scenario if things get a little bit more challenging than we think? And then what's more of our baseline or optimistic scenario, which is the one that I'm going to show you on the left is actually what's in our product right now. The Wall Street Journal surveyed 60 plus economists. When they did that, those 60 plus economists thought that we could lose potentially around 300,000 jobs next year. Know that that's not across every industry. As I mentioned, there will be certain ones impacted. We're already starting to see that, specifically related to the housing market. Interest rates have gone up a lot. The new sales of new homes have declined. I think it's something like 9 straight months. And so we're seeing a lot of impact in the mortgage industry, home construction, and so on. And there'll be a few others obviously impacted, more than that as well. But if we look at kind of a downside case, this is it. 620,000 potential jobs lost. Know this, though, when those same economists were surveyed, and the same thing that we're looking at in our more pessimistic forecast, this is expected to be a very short downturn. By the end of the year, we're actually supposed to be back in positive job growth territory. So the thing I would tell you as a business leader is be very careful about making sure you understand that anything you do to that would impact kind of, I would say, your onboarding, your hiring engine, and so on. Be mindful of that, because as we get to the later part of next year, we should already be, based on forecasts I've seen some from very smart people, we should be increasing job growth once again. Now, on the positive side, if it's more of a soft landing, which you might have seen some of those types of news stories out there, we could still be creating more than 1 million jobs. Again, there are going to be some industries impacted. The balance of the rest could still add jobs and in a very significant way. Some of the ones I would say are industries that maybe lagged coming out of COVID. They're still adding a whole bunch back. So if anybody's been to a conference this year, you probably didn't go to one the year before, or not as many. So there are things like, depending on the types of industries, like conferences are one that are up. Men's clothing stores from people returning back to work, they're up as well. So it just depends on the specific industry. Know that you have to dig deeper than any media headline, whether it's really positive or really negative, to truly understand how it happens, how it matters to your business and your hiring. The biggest one that we see right now, if you're like me, and you get on LinkedIn or these news channels and you look up at the feed, it seems like every day there's news of layoffs. You have to consider that we're at the lowest level of layoffs that we've ever been since that number has been recorded. If you look at the dark orange bar there, that's where we're projected to end 2023, even with all of the news headlines you've heard recently. So we're just not at a normal level of employee turnover. As more of those happen, just know that we're simply getting back to levels we've experienced in the past. And you see what my forecast is there that relates back to those job growth scenarios that I just displayed before. So again, a lot of what we'll see is more moderation and getting back to where we were. Even in a more of a pessimistic situation, we're still projecting, if you look in the middle, 64 million hires next year, because even in downturns, people switch jobs. So you're going to have to continue hiring, onboarding, and so on. And depending on your industry, you might not feel near as much of an impact as some others. Last two things that I'll leave you with before I'll turn it over to the other gentleman. Wage growth. I mentioned this in the outset that it's probably going to start to look a little bit more like it has in the past. It's been on a kind of a runaway train course over the last 2 years where we've seen very, very robust wages. The top part of the market, if you know some of those names that have been discussed in terms of layoffs, they also tend to be the ones who pay at the top end of the bell curve for pay. There's going to be a bit less demand and ability to pay at those really high-end ranges, which is very good for folks that pay a little bit more of what should be considered normal for the market. As that happens in some of the other factors, we should see wage growth start to moderate next year, which means that talent you're bringing in won't keep costing more and more and more the way it has over the last few years. But just know that things are still competitive, and inflation could actually push the more people back into the market, which could also help with the overall supply of talent. So last part here, just our overall thoughts for 2023. As we mentioned, the labor market's likely to change again. We've heard of the great resignation, or perhaps the great reshuffle. We might see it reshuffle one more time as people go to switch industries. Again, being a great advisor, whether it's with your hiring managers, business colleagues across the board, is going to be highly, highly important. Lots of hires still for next year. The real number that we'll be watching is, can inflation get under control? That's going to have a major, major impact on the labor market, and I would say our overall forecast as well. I'm going to hang around for for Q&A towards the end of the call, but if you'd like to connect with me afterwards, here's my information, and you will get the slide deck after the presentation as well. So Marcy, I will turn it back over to you. And Marcy, I believe you're on mute.
Thanks for the reminder, Jay. I appreciate it. I think for me in 2023, the word might be moderation, both in a positive and a pessimistic point of view, looking at those slides. So thank you, Jay. Next up, we're going to hear from the Courage Collective. For those of you that joined us last year, we got to hear from Nani, one of the colleagues at the Courage Collective, and are thrilled to welcome them back to our conversation today. The Courage Collective is deeply invested in creating a better world through better workplaces, and believe that courage and empathy are essential ingredients for our collective journey. The team at the Courage Collective is comprised of advocates, activators, educators, change makers, creators, ideators, and liberators. And as you all know from conversations with your teams, from prospective candidates, nearly 80% of employees say they want to work at a company that values diversity, equity, inclusion. People want to work in organizations where they feel valued, appreciated, and celebrated. They want to experience a sense of belonging and be their authentic self, whether they're at home, in their communities, and at work. Today, we're joined by two individuals, Daniel and Michael. Daniel's the founder of the Courage Collective. His experience includes work in entrepreneurship, venture capital, tech, consulting, education, and the nonprofit sector. What does courage mean to Daniel? Courage means showing up in moments big and small. It means understanding and embracing your own humanity and the humanity of others. It means taking the risks, doing the work, and becoming the better, more beautiful world we hope for and believe in. Michael is a global equity and inclusion advisor who believes in the inherent value and interconnectedness of all life. His professional experiences have afforded him the opportunity to lead research projects on 6 of 7 continents. And what does courage mean to Michael? Courage is a consistent decision to live bravely from our deep inner knowing. Courage then is a paradox, for it asks us to intentionally face our deepest fear so that we can discover our deepest joy. Thank you, Daniel and Michael, for joining us today.
Marcy, thank you so much for having us. We're thrilled to be here with you today. So go ahead and share my screen and we'll dig into the conversation. So as Marcy mentioned, I'm Daniel, founder of Courage Collective. I'm here with my colleague and friend, Michael. We're super excited to be here and share with you all today. A lot of respect for the work you do. We know we have people from higher learning, people in the nonprofit sector, et cetera. We're super excited and share some of your same experiences and passions. Marcy gave us an intro, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like to prioritize courage in the work that we do, and how can you maximize your impact and influence within your sphere. Really quickly about the Courage Collective. So we've been fortunate enough to work with companies ranging from Fortune 500s all the way down to 10-person startups, institutions of higher learning, and nonprofits alike. And what we found is that all of them are asking similar questions about how do we create cultures of belonging and solve these human-centered problems. And so we feel grateful to be in this space and get to move organizations towards creating cultures that center the human experience. So excited to talk with you about that today. Our grounding statement that we always use when we approach this work is this idea of courage. And it's simply this: when courageous people meet courageous moments, it moves and impacts the world. And when we think about the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, about creating cultures of belonging, it fundamentally requires courage. And so we're inviting you into that today. I loved what Jay shared. It's a great precursor because we have to think about the ways in which the world has changed, right? And so we're thinking about creating cultures of belonging for you to maximize your impact within your sphere of influence. What does that mean today compared to maybe what it meant a couple years back? The world has changed, and there are several macro themes impacting our lives and work since 2020. So we're going to go through a few of those, and then we're going to give you some actionable insights as to how you can maximize your impact and influence. But let's think of some macro themes that have been impacting our lives and work since 2020. We have to start with the global pandemic that brought the world to a pause in a way that few things have in recent history. You remember when the pandemic first happened and we thought, we'll probably be out of school or out of work for a week or two. I love this tweet by Michael Candell, who says, low-key nervous heading into my junior year of COVID. 3 years later, we're still grappling with the reality of what it is and how it changed the world as we know it. It took us to a hybrid workforce in which, people are working remotely or going into the office. Should we stay? Should we go? We need to reimagine our policies. If you work in an institution of higher learning, that probably impacted the students and the way the professionals showed up as well. And then this idea of Zoom fatigue, right? And so we're on Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, trying to be present, but then maybe the kids are in the background or our cat is climbing on the screen. Think about the ways in which the world has changed since 2020.
And as the world changes, the demographics in the world also shift. There's a correlation that dates back thousands of years between the fact that our environment does cause us as people to shift. A couple of those shifts that you have seen and experienced, 2021, we all became more familiar with the ripple effect of 2020 as individuals began to recalibrate their values, to reassess their quality of life, and to really step into a space where they are seeing synchronicities over every aspect of their being, including their vocation. They just said, I quit. You know, it was that simple. They just left with few words, maybe an email, and said, I'm going to chase my best life. And I think when we get into a space where we are experiencing the fragility of life at a high level, we start to not be able to tolerate things we have been tolerating as well up to that point. So Adam Grant speaks about what the workforce today is no longer tolerating. They're no longer tolerating toxic cultures, disrespect, non-inclusion, unethical practices, cutthroat approaches, or abusive behaviors. And if leaders don't take toxicity at least as seriously as performance, well, Houston, we have a problem. And so did you know, for example, 1 in 4 people have some type of disability, and they're now requiring of their employers some regard in that stance. No longer is it okay to say, okay, well, yeah, we can't do anything for you, but we'd love to have you. They're saying, no, 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 no. What have you built with me in mind? 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ+. And it's no longer cool for us to say, well, that's just something we don't talk about here. No, they're requiring us to talk about it, and they're holding us accountable when the ways we talk about it are harmful. By 2045, this is the year the population will be less than 50% white in the United States of America. Now, this is a huge moment as it pertains to what some have termed white fragility. Others have termed it the replacement theory, where the majority culture is now fearful that as they lose their majority status, they will lose their self-determination as it pertains to the quality of life they live. And then finally, 80% say that inclusion is important to them. So it's no longer okay for us to sit back and say, do your job, right? No, we want to do more than our job. We want to be humanized in our job. As demographics are shifting in the world, no brand can say that they have a growth strategy if they don't have a multicultural, intersectional strategy to go with it. And that's a major quote coming from Jason Rosario there at BBDO, where he's really stepping into the space of alerting the whole market at large that as it pertains to people are now requiring you to see them as mosaics, as multitudes, to borrow from the poet Walt Whitman in his poem, Song of Myself, where he says, I am large, I am multitudes. He's asking us to understand the fact that identity might be best understood in a plural sense than a singular sense. It might be best said that we have identities, not that we have an identity. And we're now looking to our employers to acknowledge our multitudes, our mosaic. We also have intergenerational dynamics that are really taking the forefront of the workforce conversation. We have 4 generations now filling up the workspace: baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Gen Z now, all of which are looking to not only work, but all of which have a different lens. Their different perspective or worldview was shaped by the environment and society, the value systems that were pervasive during the time of their teenage years predominantly. So if you really want to get into the minds of these 4 generations, look at where was society when they were teenagers. That'll tell you a lot about the values that they bring to the workplace. And those values are impacting how long they stay. Yeah, we're having retention conversations everywhere, aren't we? How do we retain the top talent that we've been able to attract? Well, for some generations, they're not looking to be retained. Like Gen Z says, we can go out for coffee. The millennial says, we can date. Gen X says, yeah, I'll be exclusive. Baby boomers are like, can we get married? And I know that's an oversimplification, right? But I hope it at least caused you to chuckle a little bit as you consider the different ways these generations are not only approaching work, but also approaching their longevity in a specific position.
You also have to think about the social issues that are impacting our collective consciousness. We're talking about the ways in which the world has changed. We talked about shifting workforce demographics, but since 2020, there have been a collection of salient social issues that have impacted the way that we interact with the world. We'd be remiss if we didn't name the polarizing political climate that we're currently existing in. Regardless of how you perceive politics, we can all acknowledge that in some form or fashion, there's tension between one or the other. We think about the attacks on LGBTQ plus rights that we've seen, people feeling excluded, the recent attack on Club Q in Colorado, where people feel like their identities are under fire. The overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was a seminal moment that changed decades of precedent and made certain people feel like what they value, what they need, their access to healthcare and well-being doesn't matter. And then the murder of George Floyd. We think about the ways in which that changed the conversation around equity, inclusion, racial justice. We think about how clearly people tuned in to this instance. You couldn't get on social media, you couldn't turn on the TV without seeing scenes like these. People taking to the streets to express their angst and frustration. Every company had a position, from Netflix to L'Oreal, from REI to Reebok. All of these brands had to be clear about their position on equity and inclusion. So how did we go from a collective conversation around race and equity to the interest in DE&I waning significantly over time? Well, I think part of the challenge has been many people reacted in order to be on the right side of history, but hadn't really internalized the true change that it was needed to sustain this work. Given the ever-evolving cultural climate, it's never been more important for all of us to intentionally consider how we show up in the world and how we show up at work. So the rest of the conversation, we're going to give you a few keys, 4 keys for maximizing your personal impact within your sphere of influence, given the way the world is changing.
Our first key is to champion psychological safety and trust within your sphere of influence. Well, what does that look like? I know, how do we operationalize it? Well, psychological safety, just based on definition alone, is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. Now, when we break that out a little bit further, there are 6 main areas by which we utilize to measure psychological safety in a space. Are you able to be your authentic self? Are you able to make mistakes? Are you able to ask questions? Are you able to challenge existing norms? Are you able to take risks? Are you able to disagree? That's a huge one, right? If mum is the word in your work environment, then we know for a fact that it is not a psychologically safe space. And so it's not only about building psychological safety, but at the core of that aim is the desire to build trust. Oh man, that 5-letter word is so important, isn't it not? Trust goes beyond competency though. And in many of our workspaces, we perpetuate a narrative where trust is based upon performance. That's over in the competency quadrant of the triangle. I believe you will deliver high quality work. And yeah, we want that. We want to be able to not only attract those who can generate that work, but we also want to see that work have consistency over a span of time. That's all well and said. However, trust cannot simply be built upon the 60 degrees of competency. We got to add 60 degrees to that, which is authenticity. I experience the real you. And here's the rub, especially when we consider that identity is plural, that intersectionality is a mosaic, that we're bringing multitudes to the table when we show up as ourselves. We are wanting the different slices of our holistic pie called identity to be able to be expressed even in our vocation. And so as I am wanting to experience the real you, you are experiencing the real me. That's what leads to empathy. I believe you care about me. Now, this is a full 180 degrees of trust. Most workspaces and environments, sadly, have only honed in on 60 degrees of that spectrum. But we need to add being able to experience the realness in each other, as well as being able to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that our colleagues are not only there to perform with us, but they actually care for us as well.
Next key is to transcend binary thinking and embrace nuance. We think about it in this idea of holding two truths. And this is a pretty profound one if you really internalize it. Again, earlier we mentioned the polarizing climate that we currently exist in. It's pretty antithetical to that polarization to think that two things can be true at the same time. When you look at this image, they are both mirrors. Though one is shattered, they are both mirrors. So is it true that we can hold both as true at the same time? So for example, you can have made some meaningful progress when it comes to DE&I. That can be true. And you also can still have a long way to go. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. It's not a zero-sum game. We don't live in a world that has to be mutually exclusive. Two things can exist at once. What we're getting at is this idea of the false dilemma fallacy. False dilemma fallacy says there's a limited number of choices, outcomes, or views, when in fact, more possibilities exist. So when we're thinking about maximizing our impact and influence within our sphere, we have to know transcending binary thinking is one of the ways to do that. When you look at this picture, what do you see? Again, it goes at this notion of, can two things exist? Do you see angels or do you see devils? The truth is they're both there. And one might argue that in order for you to see one, you have to see the other clearly. How many things like that exist in our life that if we created space, we could see that multiple possibilities, multiple patterns, multiple options exist. We have to transcend binary thinking and embrace nuance. Key number 3 is to cultivate belonging and prioritize authentic allyship. When we talk about belonging, we're talking about the feeling of security and support, the belief that you can be your whole and authentic self and experience a sense of acceptance and inclusion when expressing your identity.
And everyone right now is looking for the secret serum to crack the formula of belonging, right? We want to try to put it into a formulaic equation that we can constantly produce on demand. And yet I don't see belonging that way. I know the scholars are giving us some great data feedback based upon the research. But at the end of the day, I do believe that artistry is really what belonging is all about. It's about looking at how I can activate certain realities in my sphere of influence. For example, if we talk about diversity, we're really talking about observing and acknowledging difference. If we move to equity, we're talking about validating and affirming that same difference. Inclusion is when we get to the level of integrating and accepting that difference. Belonging might be seen as the Nicene fields or the nirvana of this spectral journey, this continuum. It's all about celebrating and appreciating that difference. Every person is born with 4 inalienable rights as it pertains to belonging. You were born to be seen. You were born to be heard. You were born to be nurtured. And you were born to be encouraged. And it's so often that I have found working with different companies, it doesn't matter if you're a multi-level international org or if you are a 12-person startup. The fact is, many people see these 4 boxes as privileges, options, benefits of being a part of the environment. But I've heard few people frame them as inalienable rights for each and every person that is born on this planet. And so as we look at the artistry of belonging, we're asking ourselves, okay, so why are people getting a little weary of talking about belonging? You know, as Daniel pointed out, the metrics are showing gloom and doom for the DEI specialists coming up. But why is it that people are being so fatigued? And I think it's because what we saw in 2020 was a reactive posture that was based on, ooh, I don't want people to think bad of me. So what can I do to show my solidarity, right? But that's not authentic allyship. That's performative allyship. Whenever I feel like I need to perform my way into the graces of a population, audience, or bystander, that is not authentically, organically coming from me. I'm reacting versus proactively acknowledging. Authentic allyship is the practice of emphasizing these things, as well as advancing the interests of a specific demographic. It's asking you to embody this journey. So as we move to this quote that I love by Dr. Crystal Jones, there's a big difference between the ideas, all are welcome here, and this was created with you in mind. That feels good, because it gives me maybe a hint, a viewpoint, a window to peer at the great resignation through. I can see this mass population of 11+ million people saying, I no longer just want to be welcomed into a space. I want to go into spaces where I know it was created with me in mind. And so our fourth key is keep the vision in sight and continue doing the work. I've already said that this work is difficult, and a lot of people are starting to get fatigued. Maybe even some of you on this very presentation are like, oh goodness, here we go again. The DEI guys are coming, right? We are oftentimes seen as pallbearers because we show up to lay things to rest, right? But I believe that DEIB, including the belonging, can be a conversation that is as celebratory as any holiday or party that you've ever attended. But it has to start with you. We can no longer use these huge words or terms like organization, institution, government, society, culture to try to navigate the challenges that we're facing in our sphere of influence. It starts with us. All of those words speak to a collection of individuals. It's not just the policy change. There has to be personal change. It's just not a collective action to where we all change our profile pics on a social media platform. It's about individual action, me allowing my own introspection and reflection to yield a different me, a better me, an improved version of myself that I can now show up with as I meet the world where it is at. So what gives us hope? All of this workout talk, my muscles feel kind of sore, right? But what gives us hope moving forward? It feels daunting. Yes, it does. And it is daunting. And I don't think we need to use toxic optimism, toxic positivity to undercut us being truthful about the path forward. It's not going to be easy to build the world we all believe can be built. Got to take it one step at a time. However, I'm very inspired by this anecdote that comes from history. Many people don't know that when Martin Luther King, during the March on Washington, transitioned into what we now herald as the I Have a Dream speech, that was not in his notes there on the podium that day. He did not bring that speech with him. He did not even prepare that speech before that moment. As a matter of fact, that was a part of a previous speech that he had given months before, a speech at which Mahalia Jackson was in attendance. Now, what's so cool about this story is Mahalia Jackson is seated with everyone else, listening to Martin Luther King Jr. talk about the uphill struggles we are all going to face moving forward. She's sitting behind him, though, so strategically, she can influence him in ways that other listeners cannot. And right at the crescendo of Martin Luther King talking about this blank check that when cashed registered insufficient funds, Mahalia calls out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And that one affirmation from Mahalia shifted the trajectory of that speech, and I believe shifted the trajectory of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, because it's at that point that he turns away from his notes, moves into an extemporaneous presentation, and begins to give us the words that many of us have read since we were children. I too have a dream. What did Mahalia Jackson know at that moment? Mahalia knew that only forecasting the struggle would not yield the longevity necessary, the hope necessary to face the challenge so that we could achieve this ultimate dream. And so she asked Martin, tell him about the dream. And there's a dream we all have. This is a gathering of humanitarians, builders, influencers, and creatives. If the work ever gets disjointed, disconnected from the dream that brought us to the work, there is no way we'll be able to sustain the stamina necessary to accomplish our vision and our dream. And so I love this quote by James Baldwin: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Yeah, we got a lot to face for sure. Yes, your culture and your company has a lot to face. This world is going to continue changing. However, what is the dream that got you started in the first place? And how can you utilize that dream to create an eternal reservoir of energy that revives and regenerates your efforts on a day-to-day basis?
So in summary, our 4 keys: champion psychological safety and trust within your sphere of influence, transcend binary thinking and embrace nuance, cultivate belonging and prioritize authentic allyship. And to Michael's point, keep the vision in sight and continue doing the work. Real quick, here's how you can work with us. And so we do consulting, training, and leadership development. We were fortunate enough to work with Marcy and the great team at Another Source. You can take a picture of this QR code over here on the right. We do have an email list, so if you're interested in that. But we do, like I said, consulting, training, leadership development. We have worked with higher ed institutions, and we've also worked with nonprofits. So if any of the stuff that we shared resonated with you, feel free to get in touch. I'll turn it back over to Marcy and to Evelyn to finish us out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Michael. As always, I think I saw a note in the chat, goosebumps. So we had the opportunity to hear Jay, Daniel, and Mike share their expertise, their perspective, their wisdom, their courage with us today. There were a couple of things that I heard most recently with Daniel and Michael that stood out, that I'd like to close with. And that's Simon Sinek's quote: "A team is not a group that just works together, but a team is a group of people that trust each other." And it's never been more important than now, and how we intentionally show up. Thank you for spending this time with us today. We'll stay on for a Q&A if there's any Q&A. And if we don't have the chance to hear from many of you, thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful holiday season.